a lot more difficult when the artist is still alive.
All right, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Hey, Jared.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Doing great. Doing great. How you liking New Orleans so far?
I love New Orleans. The only problem is I don't get to visit it very often.
Yes. Well, have you eaten anything special yet?
I went to Herb Saint last night, which was pretty cool. And then I insisted on beignets this morning.
Absolutely.
And then last night, I have friends here. They took me to New Orleans East to a Vietnamese billiards hall with Vietnamese bar food. And that was amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for stopping by for Baldwin & Co. Let's throw the obvious kind of one out there just to set the stage. What does success mean to you?
Success. Well, what it means to me is being able to tell my story in my voice, in my way, without any compromises. That's actually kind of difficult to do. I've been lucky that my books have actually sold, and we have a TV series coming out in a few weeks on HBO based on this first novel. But none of that would have been possible if I hadn't been authentic to my own voice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is. Are you excited about that?
I'm pretty excited about it. The only problem is if the series is a failure, everybody's going to blame me, and if the series is a success, no one's going to look at me. So that's the paradox of having your book made into a TV series.
Yeah. Are you going to be? I know sometimes that when that happens, you're not necessarily always involved in the writing of it. Are you going to be involved in that?
No, that's a whole separate art. I'm an executive producer, so the big part of the job was actually just getting it made. That took several years of meetings. Because this is The Sympathizer is a novel from the perspective of a Vietnamese spy, communist spy. It's a very, it has a lot of Vietnamese themes going on for obvious reasons. Hollywood just didn't know what to do with it, And so it took a few years of persuasion of political turmoil in the rest of the country to get Hollywood kind of sensitive to what the book is talking about. So it was a big lift just to get that far. And then the writing was just another thing. I didn't have time to do that.
Yeah, I was listening. I like we here are like consummate perfectionists, and so I literally prepare up until the very end. I was listening to a conversation with someone talking about the way that America consistently forgets that a lot of refugees and/or immigrants, but specifically refugees, come here because of war. Mm-hmm. Both war that we sometimes have our hands in, but also, personally, I feel like we always have our hands in most anything that's kind of going on. But that we kind of forget that, and we also don't situate that properly in Hollywood and or literature sometimes. Talk a little bit more about that, because that was a profound insider perspective. I think you were able to give to that particular conversation.
Yeah, I came as a refugee from Vietnam in 1975, and that was because of the war that the United States was involved in. Now it's ancient history. That's like almost 50 years ago, and for most Americans, they weren't even alive during that time. Well, thank you so much. I guess I betrayed my own age, but I think for many Americans, the idea of the immigrant is very powerful. It's part of our American dream. The refugee totally complicates that. So the way that most Americans make sense out of refugees is just to call them immigrants. I insist on being called a refugee because, as I argue in a few books, many refugees are grateful for having been rescued by the United States, but maybe we wouldn't have needed to be rescued by the United States if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. And we see that contradiction being played out over and over and over again. And part of what it means to become an American for a lot of refugees is to agree silently that we're not going to talk about that part, the part of the war and so on. And I'm someone who believes that war is actually very integral to the United States. We have a lot of domestic divisions and so on, but we're kind of fairly unified, bipartisan-wise, in terms of agreeing that the U.S. has the right to bomb any country it wants to or intervene in any country it wants to. But when we do that as Americans, we create displacement. We create lots of refugees. And it's important for Americans sort of to mentally disconnect those two realities of our being a military-industrial complex. Now are suddenly having these refugees from different places come. Some of us are scared of these refugees coming from certain countries, and we have to create that American dream narrative to make ourselves feel better about why they're here all of a sudden.
Yeah. There are two things I think about when you're saying that. I want to say this is Toni K. Bombara. She said the job of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And then, the revolution irresistible. Then I also was thinking about a nation keeps its shape by the stories it tells itself. That's something me and Annette Gordon-Reed were just talking about. When you think about those two quotes, in the work you do, but the work that you also read and love, which I may ask you about later.
Mm.
Is there a obligation of the artist to be political? Similar to what Nina Simone also said.
Well, that's a controversial statement because there are a lot of artists in this country and scholars and critics and so on who don't want to see art and politics connected, right? But from my experience, I'm certainly put myself in that genealogy, that lineage of writers who are committed, who don't see a difference between art and politics. That makes our lives harder. That's not what's rewarded generally in this country. Absolutely. And then, it's hard enough to be an artist, but to be an artist who also is trying to use the art to say something political and make it beautiful at the same time, as the writers you're quoting have done. It's not simply to make the revolution irresistible, it's to make the revolution beautiful. Yes, and I believe that you can do both at the same time, but there are a lot of artists in this country who don't think in that fashion. So those of us who do, we're willingly putting an extra, what in my mind, necessary challenge on ourselves.
Yeah. Now, this is something that just kind of just popped in my mind. I was telling someone yesterday when like smart people look up in the sky, like it's like something divinely kind of coming down when they're talking. Do you think that you can separate like the art from the artist, right? Like, so like when people do, and I've been quoting this book a lot, and I might need to reread it because I've just loved it so much, but Monsters by Claire Dieter. And when you're thinking about someone like Kanye West who says things that are problematic at times, can you still love that art? Like when you think about, it's a book with an L name, but the book questions the concept of like, I can't remember. But it has questionable things in like fiction that has like these things that are now taboo.
Yeah.
Can you separate the art from the artist? Is that something that you believe?
I believe so, but obviously it's a lot more difficult when the artist is still alive. Absolutely. And it's like making money off of your choices, or if you're not buying the thing, you're borrowing it and you're still giving the artist some visibility and all that. So I get it when people are too personally offended to support an artist. But in my case, I think about how I have seen a lot of racist Vietnam War movies. Okay. Yeah. And I still watch them because I think you could actually make a work of art that is beautiful and powerful and racist all at the same time. We have a long legacy, or sexist or whatever. And so I still teach Apocalypse Now, for example, by Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola, even though this novel, The Sympathizer, satirizes that movie plus a lot of other American Vietnam War movies. Or sometimes it's a selective issue. Like I love the work of Spike Lee, but honestly, Da 5 Bloods, not a good movie. And especially the way that it deals with Vietnam, not good. But I still watched it, still support it. Sometimes it's easier, of course, when the artist is dead. So a big influence on The Sympathizer was a novel called Journey to the End of the Night by a guy named Louis Ferdinand Céline. It was a really hugely impactful novel in France in the 1920s or 1930s. And then during World War II, Céline became a Nazi collaborator and really a rabid anti-Semite. So I know all that stuff, but it's still a beautiful novel. And so, I think intellectually, we have to be able to separate the art from the artist. It's just whether emotionally we can do it.
That's what I was going to say, because I think it's predicated it's emotionally tied to the idea that this somehow came out of them, right? Because art has to be like influenced, or this is the general held idea, right? That art is like influenced by like the spirit of the artist, right? In some way. So surely they hold these same ideals, right? And or like we're first in the film, things unconsciously make their way into the film. So yeah, that's something I think about often. And I definitely agree with you in terms of it's definitely easier when they're dead. It's almost like, yeah. You know what I mean?
Well, I think, obviously we tend to idealize and idolize our heroes, including our writers and our artists and so on. And I understand the impulse, but it's a dangerous impulse because it mistakes the artist as somehow not human. Yeah. And the artist is very human. Yeah. And, we know human beings are complicated. And, part of what I argue in some of my work is the separation of the human from the inhuman is actually really dangerous. That's the us versus them mentality. So we're the human ones, they're the inhuman ones. And that justifies all kinds of inhuman behavior towards them, allows us to be inhuman. So in looking at our artists and their artworks, the ones that I respond to the most viscerally, the artworks demonstrate that our humanity is inseparable from our inhumanity. Even those of us who feel we've been victimized by history or by whatever cause, it doesn't make us better human beings. Sometimes it makes us worse human beings. And artists are not immune from that.
People feel like that. I was thinking about something else I heard you kind of just talk about was like the way that, so refugee, I think, is dealing with two things on a large scale: distance and time. Right? You were talking about where there are folks who haven't seen other folks in their family and or in their friend groups for 20 years. And you were like, so many folks whose story that is. And it's both, like I said, this tie is wrapped up in time and distance. Does that, like another thing you were just talking about is that there's a certain pride that some people hold, right, in living through the violence that they have experienced. I want to talk about resilience, though. Does that create a certain level of resilience, and how do you nurture healthy, like in a healthy way, nurture their resilience?
Yeah, well, it can produce resilience. I mean, I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community. Hundreds of thousands of people fled to the United States and other countries, and they had to survive and they had to be resilient. It didn't necessarily make them better human beings. They survived. They were resilient in the sense that many of them got jobs, raised families, did all the outward signs of resilience that you're talking about. But I've met also a lot of people who were just emotionally screwed up by the experience. And then they passed on that trauma to their kids because they never worked through what they had been through. So is that resilience? I mean, they're still alive. They but the trauma has been transmitted through the generations because their resilience was not a healing of what they, or not even a recognition of what they had been through.
I wonder, because I was trying to say I agree with you, but I have another question. Is healing a necessary component of resilience?
No, I think you can be resilient and not be healed. I mean, it depends how you define resilience. I'm thinking of resilience as simply you're still alive. You're still capable of functioning. And it's important to acknowledge that people who've been through traumatic experiences, some of them are not resilient. Some of them don't survive. Some of them are broken by that experience. Some of them have the trappings of material survival, right? And so that they are resilient. But I think when you're healed, that goes beyond resilience. That is a restoration, let's say, versus just resilience.
That was a nice thing, nice little journey right there. Because I was just thinking about it. That's why I love having conversations like this, because it just makes you think all the way through. Can you describe a significant goal you've pursued within your creative pursuits and the strategies you employ to kind of overcome any obstacles that kind of came your way?
The way I survived my refugee experience, watching what my parents went through, because they had a very difficult life here as refugees in the United States. The way I survived, the way I was resilient was that I emotionally shut down. I became very numb. And I'm very successful as an academic, got a PhD, et cetera. And I did it by being invulnerable emotionally, turning myself off.